Welcome to our deep dive, and this time we're looking at a topic that really makes you think differently about history and identity. It's the possibility of same-sex relationships between men in the Swiss Alps.
Wow.
Yeah. I was looking at some research you shared about these farmers and herders
Yeah.
spending months in these like really isolated mountain communities.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I'm already intrigued.
Well, what makes this deep dive so compelling is that we're not exactly working with stacks of love letters
Oh,
or
no.
diaries or anything like that. We're
Yeah.
kind of doing detective work here, piecing together a picture from, the historical context, social patterns, and just a few really intriguing hints.
Okay, so let's unpack this. So these farmers and herders were practicing what's called transhumance,
Exactly.
right? So that's where they moved their livestock up to those high alpine pastures for months at a time.
Right.
Like, I can only imagine how isolated they must have been.
Isolation is definitely key here. Imagine spending months away from your family, from your village, facing those harsh conditions.
Right.
With just this small group of men.
Yeah.
The kind of bonds that form in those circumstances can be pretty intense.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. We're talking about a time when any sexual relationship between men, what was called sodomy back then,
Right.
was completely illegal across Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And in Switzerland, punishments varied by region, but they could be as severe as death.
Exactly. And that's what makes the court records even more fascinating.
Right.
In Zurich, for example,
Yeah.
179 people were
Uh-huh.
executed for sodomy between 1400 and 1798. So that number tells us two things.
Okay.
One, that same-sex relationships were happening,
Mhm.
and two, that the authorities were really trying to suppress them.
So it seems like a paradox, though,
Yeah.
because if it was so taboo,
Mm-hmm.
why do the records suggest it was somewhat common?
Right.
How do we make sense of that?
Right. Well, I think this discrepancy really highlights how power and social control can actually influence what history remembers
Yeah.
and what it forgets.
Yeah.
So what was considered acceptable could vary wildly, depended on the region, the time period,
Right.
and even a person's social standing.
That makes sense. So even though there were laws against it, certain relationships might have been overlooked
Right.
or tolerated. But it makes you wonder what went on in those isolated alpine communities. Did those same laws and social pressures apply?
It's definitely a question worth exploring.
Yeah.
And this is where things get even more intriguing. When you look at the Swiss court records for sodomy cases,
Mm-hmm.
the age difference between the partners is often the focus, with the younger partners often escaping punishment.
What do you make of that?
Oh, that's interesting.
It seems less about the act itself and more about maintaining that social order.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like they acknowledged power imbalances within these relationships,
Yeah.
maybe even accepting certain forms of same-sex relationships.
As long as they fit into those existing hierarchies,
Mm-hmm.
which is a bit disturbing, actually.
It does challenge our modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
But that's why understanding the historical context is so crucial.
Right.
Helps us avoid imposing our own values on the past.
Okay, so we've got this lack of direct documentation
Yeah.
due to, the social stigma and the legal consequences.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have these really tantalizing clues in Swiss culture,
Yeah.
like those old folk ballads that
Right.
have been passed down through generations.
Exactly.
And a lot of them are about these deep friendships between men, sometimes ending tragically.
It's important to be careful about interpreting these stories through a modern lens.
Oh, of course.
But they do offer a glimpse into what might have been considered too dangerous to express directly.
Right, so they're almost like a coded language
Mm-hmm.
for emotions and experiences that were taboo.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, could these songs be hinting at something more? Let's look at a specific example. The ballad, The Shepherd's Lament.
Okay.
It tells this story of two young shepherds,
Mm-hmm.
and they share everything. Their work, their dreams, even their sleeping role under the stars.
Wow.
And the lyrics are filled with this longing and sorrow.
Yeah.
When one shepherd dies,
Oh.
leaving the other utterly heartbroken.
Oh.
Now, while the ballad doesn't explicitly mention romantic love,
Right.
considering the historical context,
Yeah.
it's hard not to wonder if there's a subtext of deeper feelings there.
Wow. That's a really powerful example. It definitely makes you think about the different ways people might have expressed their feelings in a society where they couldn't be open about same-sex relationships.
Exactly.
So it adds a whole new dimension to how we think about the Swiss Alps. Like those mountains hold a lot more than just scenic beauty.
Right.
There are layers of human stories hidden within them. But if same-sex relationships were so taboo in Europe at the time,
Yeah.
does this mean it was purely a European phenomenon?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to our next point. Comparing this period in Swiss history to other cultures and time periods
Oh, yeah.
to see if we can find any parallels. What we find might surprise you.
I'm all ears.
Okay.
Let's see what other clues we can uncover.
Right.
Okay, so we've established that same-sex relationships existed in the Swiss Alps, even with all those social and legal risks.
Right.
But, like, were they completely unique to that time and place?
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you included some research on other cultures that had, kind of similar social structures and environments.
Exactly. When we compare what was happening in the Swiss Alps to other cultures and historical periods, we start seeing some pretty fascinating parallels.
Yeah.
And one that comes to mind is seafaring communities.
Oh, okay.
All-male crews, those long voyages,
Right.
isolation from, the quote-unquote outside world.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar?
It does. It echoes that whole sense of isolation and that close-knit community we talked about with those alpine herders.
Mm.
But did those seafaring communities actually have similar relationships going on?
Historical records, even though fragmented, point to same-sex relationships as being not uncommon among sailors.
Hmm.
You got to think about those conditions. Cramped quarters, constant danger.
Yeah.
You're completely reliant on your shipmates.
Right.
That forges incredibly strong bonds.
Right.
And just like in the Alps, these relationships very rarely appear in any official documents.
It makes sense. If it was dangerous to be open about your feelings in the Alps, I can only imagine what the stakes were on a ship
Right.
in the middle of the ocean.
Exactly.
Where the captain had absolute authority.
Right.
So if we don't have documents like, diaries or letters,
Mm-hmm.
how do we even know that those relationships existed?
We have to look for clues in those less obvious places.
Okay.
For instance, personal letters.
Yeah.
Sometimes hint at deep emotional connections between sailors.
Huh?
And even ship logs, which were very official documents, sometimes record punishments for sodomy, which implies that the behavior was definitely happening, even if the relationships themselves weren't, directly acknowledged.
It's kind of amazing how historians can piece together these hidden stories from fragments and hints like that.
Mm-hmm.
So what does this comparison to those seafaring communities tell us about the Swiss Alps then?
It suggests that the social and emotional needs met by these relationships, in these isolated all-male environments might be universal.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not just about the specific culture or time period.
Yeah.
It's about that fundamental human need for connection and intimacy.
That really challenges the idea that same-sex relationships are a purely modern thing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like they've been a part of human experience all along, even if they were hidden from view.
Exactly. And it highlights the limitations of traditional historical narratives, which often focus on that dominant culture, and they ignore the experiences of marginalized groups.
This whole discussion makes me think about another all-male environment where same-sex relationships were historically documented. Okay. The military. Throughout history, military units have often been places where men formed incredibly strong bonds, forged in combat and shared hardship.
Absolutely. You're relying on each other for survival.
Right.
You're literally putting your life in someone else's hands.
Yeah.
That kind of experience can create this incredible sense of closeness,
Yeah.
a level of intimacy that really transcends ordinary friendship.
And in some cultures, these bonds were actually acknowledged and even celebrated, sometimes taking on ritualistic or symbolic forms. It seems like there's been a wide spectrum of acceptance and tolerance towards same-sex relationships throughout history,
Absolutely.
even within the same culture at different times.
That's a crucial point. The historical record is full of contradictions and complexities.
Right.
And, that's what makes it so fascinating to study. We're not just uncovering facts. We're really grappling with that messy, nuanced reality of human experience.
This whole discussion has really broadened my perspective.
Good.
I'm starting to see same-sex relationships not as something new or unusual, but as a recurring theme, woven into the fabric of human history.
I like that.
But we've been focusing mostly on social and cultural factors.
Right.
What about biology? What role does biology play in all of this?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's time to bring in the biological perspective. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the animal kingdom.
Okay.
Homosexual behavior has been observed in over 1,500 animal species,
Really?
from insects to mammals.
Wow, I had no idea it was that widespread.
Mm-hmm.
So same-sex attraction isn't just a human thing then?
Not at all.
Okay.
And it's not a recent development either.
Right.
Scientists have been documenting these behaviors for decades, and they believe that they serve a variety of evolutionary purposes, from strengthening social bonds to regulating population growth.
So while we can't directly compare human societies to animal behavior,
Right.
it does challenge the notion that same-sex attraction is somehow unnatural or like a deviation from the norm, you know?
Exactly. It suggests that same-sex attraction is part of that natural spectrum of sexuality,
Yeah.
woven into the fabric of life itself.
That's a really powerful thought.
Right.
And it makes you wonder why same-sex relationships have been so stigmatized in so many human societies.
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
There are many factors involved: social norms, religious beliefs, political agendas.
Yeah.
But the biological evidence clearly shows that same-sex attraction is not a choice.
Right.
Nor is it unique to humans. It's a natural part of who we are.
This brings us back to the Swiss Alps and those men who found love and companionship in those isolated communities. Given what we know about the biological basis of same-sex attraction, it's likely that some of them were just drawn to other men, regardless of their circumstances.
Absolutely. But those circumstances definitely played a role in how those attractions were expressed and experienced. You know, the lack of access to women, the need for companionship and intimacy in that harsh environment, the pressure to conform to those societal norms. All of these factors would shape their lives and relationships.
It's like a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have all these pieces.
It is.
You know, the historical context, the social pressures, those cultural clues, the biological evidence. And we're just trying to fit them together to make a complete picture. But even if we can never fully understand those lives, I think it's so important to acknowledge that they existed and to honor their experiences.
I completely agree. These stories may have been silenced or forgotten for centuries, but they're definitely a part of our shared human history. And by bringing them to light, we're not just learning about the past, we're challenging the way we think about the present and the future.
I think that's a really powerful takeaway. And, you know, we've been so focused on the human element, you know, the social and cultural factors and those biological aspects. But looking at your research, it seems like the environment itself played a pretty significant role in the lives of these men. What can you tell us about that?
You're right. It's crucial to remember that those alpine communities weren't just a social setting. They were embedded in this powerful landscape, those towering peaks, those vast glaciers, those unpredictable storms. You know, they would shaped these men's lives in really profound ways.
I can only imagine when I was hiking in the Alps, even for a short time, the isolation and like the power of those mountains were incredible. I can see how that environment could foster both a sense of awe and a need for resilience, you know?
Exactly. Living in that kind of environment would have demanded adaptability, self-reliance, and a deep respect for those forces of nature. And it's important to note that nature doesn't make moral judgments.
It simply exists in all its diversity and complexity.
So do you think that being surrounded by nature's diversity might have influenced how these men viewed themselves and their relationships?
It's an intriguing thought. Imagine spending months immersed in this landscape that constantly reminds you of nature's boundless creativity and variety. It's possible that this fostered a greater sense of acceptance and openness, even if it wasn't consciously expressed.
It's like nature was mirroring back to them the diversity that existed within themselves.
It's a beautiful way to think about it.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that the human story is inseparable from the story of nature. We are part of that web of life, you know, interconnected and interdependent.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. So much of what we've learned about the Swiss Alps can be connected to, like, those larger themes of human nature, those societal pressures, and our relationship with the natural world.
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
What we uncover about the past often has really profound implications for how we understand and address the challenges of the present.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is a perfect place to pause
Yeah.
for now.
Okay.
But I have a feeling our journey is far from over.
Oh, absolutely. There's still so much to explore.
Yeah.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to delve into some specific historical sources.
Okay.
We're going to look at some actual records and accounts
Yeah.
that hopefully will shed even more light on what life might have been like for those men who found love and companionship in the Swiss Alps.
I'm definitely ready for more.
Yeah.
But until then, I encourage our listeners to, think about what we've talked about.
Yes.
And to consider the ways in which these hidden stories can really challenge our understanding of history, sexuality, and the human experience.
And as always, keep exploring, keep questioning,
Yeah.
and keep listening for those whispers of history that can guide us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Welcome back to our deep dive. You know, digging into these unseen histories of queer life in the Swiss Alps has been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
We've explored the social context, compared it to other cultures and historical periods.
Right.
We even looked at the biological basis for same-sex attraction. But now it feels like it's time to kind of zoom back in on the Swiss Alps.
Yeah.
And try to understand as best we can the lives of these men who found love and companionship in these really isolated communities.
You're right. It's time to really get into the specifics.
Yeah.
Examine the historical sources that can hopefully shed light on their experiences.
You know, going through all this research that you shared, I was struck by how challenging it is to find direct evidence.
Oh, for sure.
We're talking about a time and place where silence was like the norm.
Right.
And just expressing same-sex desire could have really serious consequences.
Absolutely. But even without that explicit documentation, there are sources we can look at, those fragments of information that can help us reconstruct those lives and relationships.
Like what kind of sources can help us fill in those gaps?
Well, court records are one place we can start.
Okay.
Now, these are tricky because they often reflect the biases and prejudices of the time.
Yeah.
We have to read between the lines
Right.
to understand what they're actually revealing about the social dynamics at play.
So it's not just about what the records say, it's about what they don't say.
Exactly.
Silences can be just as telling as the actual words.
For example, we know that in some Swiss cantons,
Yeah.
the punishment for sodomy, which was the term used for sexual acts between men, was death.
Oh.
But in other regions, there seems to have been this more lenient approach, kind of like a don't ask, don't tell policy.
That's so interesting. Why do you think there was such a difference in how they approached it?
It probably had to do with several factors. The influence of religious authorities, social structures of each community, even economic considerations. In some cases, it might have been more practical to just ignore these relationships,
Right.
as long as they weren't causing any public scandal or disrupting the social order.
It seems like maintaining that social order was the most important thing.
It was.
And it makes me think about something you mentioned earlier. The focus on age difference in sodomy cases. What can you tell us about that?
It's a really fascinating detail.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at those court records, you find that the focus was often on the age difference between the partners, with younger partners often escaping any kind of punishment.
So it wasn't really about the act itself.
Right.
It was about who was involved and if it challenged those power dynamics.
Precisely. It suggests that there was some level of awareness, maybe even acceptance of these same-sex relationships,
Right.
as long as they didn't disrupt the existing social hierarchy. A younger partner,
Yeah.
especially one who's seen as being coerced,
Right.
might be treated more leniently.
While the older partner would then face those legal consequences.
It's a little unsettling.
It is.
It suggests that exploitation or abuse might have been totally overlooked if it fit within those accepted power structures.
It definitely reflects the values and beliefs of that time.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the importance of understanding that historical context. When we look at these sources, you know, we can't judge the past just by our modern standards.
That's a really important point. So court records give us glimpses, but they're limited.
Yeah.
What other sources can help us paint a more complete picture?
Well, as we talked about before, folklore and cultural traditions can offer some valuable insights.
Right.
You know, songs, stories, even those local legends, they can really reveal those societal attitudes and practices that might not have been documented in those official records. They give us a different lens to view the past.
You mentioned some Swiss folk songs.
I did. That seem to hint at those same-sex relationships. Can you give us like a specific example of how these songs might have functioned as this coded language?
Sure. There's this ballad called The Alpine Oath.
Oh,
It tells the story of two young men who pledge this eternal loyalty to each other while they're tending their flocks high in the mountains.
right.
And the lyrics describe their bond as stronger than the mountain rock,
Wow.
and their love as deeper than the valley's depths.
That imagery is so powerful.
It is.
And you're saying that within the context of the time, those lyrics could actually be interpreted as referring to something more than just friendship.
Exactly. Remember, this was a time when expressing romantic love between men was extremely taboo.
Yeah.
So these songs might have provided a way for people to express those feelings indirectly through metaphor and allegory.
It's like this secret language, a way to communicate something that couldn't be said openly.
Precisely. And it speaks to the creativity and resilience of those who had to live their lives in those shadows.
Right. So we've got these songs, we've got those court records, these whispers of something more. Are there any other, like, cultural clues that might point to these same-sex relationships existing in the Swiss Alps?
There are. Local legends and stories, the kind that are passed down for generations.
Right.
Sometimes they offer some pretty intriguing glimpses into the social norms and practices that weren't officially documented. For example, there's this story about a specific alpine meadow.
Okay.
It was known as the Shepherd's Tryst, and it was said that young men would gather there under the full moon to celebrate their bonds of brotherhood.
That's fascinating, even if they're, kind of shrouded in myths and legend.
Right.
Do you think these stories can tell us something real about what was going on?
I do. While we have to be careful about taking them literally, they often reflect those underlying social realities and cultural norms.
It's like these locations become part of this hidden map. A way for people to find each other, to form connections in a world that was otherwise hostile or dangerous to them.
It really highlights the fact that even during times of persecution or repression, people find ways to create those spaces for themselves, to build those communities, to love and be loved.
This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes. We started with what seemed like a simple question.
Right.
Did same-sex relationships exist in the Swiss Alps?
Yeah.
But it's become this rich exploration of history, culture, biology, even our connection with nature.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about those facts and dates. It's about the lives of real people, their loves, their losses, their struggles, their triumphs.
And in the case of these men in the Swiss Alps, their stories, even though they were often hidden or just whispered, they're a powerful testament to that human need for connection and intimacy, no matter the obstacles.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
And I think that's the most important takeaway from our deep dive. It's not just about, uncovering the past. It's about connecting it to the present and using it to create a more inclusive and compassionate future.
Absolutely.
We've learned that these same-sex relationships have always existed, often hidden in the shadows.
Right.
But they're still a really important part of the human experience.
I couldn't agree more. And by understanding and acknowledging those hidden histories, we can hopefully challenge that prejudice and discrimination that still exists today.
Right.
And create a world where everyone can love and live freely.
This feels like the perfect place to end our deep dive.
It does.
It's been such an honor to explore this with you and share these stories with our listeners.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listener, I would say this. Never stop questioning, never stop exploring, and never stop listening for those whispers of history.
Yeah.
There are so many stories waiting to be uncovered, and each one has the power to change how we see the world.